The morning mist clung to Hyde Park like a whispered secret on the 15th of May, 1816, softening the edges of London's grandest riding grounds into something almost dreamlike. Miss Eleanor Hartley sat astride her chestnut mare at the periphery of Rotten Row, where the unfashionable riders lingered, watching the elegant parade of society's finest as they trotted past on glossy thoroughbreds worth more than her father's annual income. The leather reins felt familiar and comforting in her gloved hands, worn supple from years of use, and the warmth of her horse beneath her provided the only genuine comfort she had known in the 3 weeks since her sister had insisted she accompany the family to London for the season. At 26, Eleanor knew precisely what she was in the eyes of the ton: a regrettable spinster, too tall, too outspoken, too enthusiastic about horses and country matters to have ever secured a suitable match. She had made her peace with it, or so she told herself each morning when she rose before dawn to escape to the park, to this one place where she could breathe freely and remember who she had been before society's judgment had settled upon her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The mare shifted beneath her, eager to run, and Eleanor stroked her neck with quiet affection, murmuring softly. Her brother Thomas had taught her to ride like this, truly ride, before the fever had taken him 5 years ago, and every morning in the saddle felt like a conversation with his memory. The fashionable set swept past in their perfectly tailored habits, and Eleanor recognized the high, carrying voice of Viscountess Ashford before she saw her, that sharp tone that could strip the petals from a rose. The Viscountess rode alongside 2 other ladies, and their words drifted back on the cool morning air with cruel clarity. Poor Eleanor Hartley, still haunting the park like a ghost, the Viscountess said with a laugh that held no warmth. One would think she might spare herself the embarrassment, truly, at her age, clinging to her horse like some manner of groom. The other ladies tittered, and Eleanor felt the familiar tightness in her chest, that small death of dignity that came with being discussed as though one were invisible. She kept her eyes forward, her back straight, refusing to grant them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. This was her portion in life, she had learned, to be the cautionary tale, the example of what became of girls who loved the wrong things and spoke too freely, and failed to simper and flatter as society demanded. But here, in these early morning hours when the mist still clung to the grass and her mare danced with barely restrained energy beneath her, Eleanor Hartley could remember what it felt like to be free, and for a few stolen moments, that was enough. The ground trembled first, a low thunder that rolled through the morning air before Eleanor saw its source, and then he appeared through the thinning mist like something from legend, itself a rider mounted on a stallion so black it seemed to absorb the pale morning light. The horse was magnificent, all power and controlled grace, its coat gleaming like polished jet. But it was the man astride it who commanded attention, sitting with the kind of effortless authority that came not from pride but from absolute mastery of his craft. Eleanor recognized him instantly, for who in London did not know the Duke of Ravenscroft, though she had never been close enough to see him properly until this moment. William Blackwood rode as though he and the stallion were a single creature, his hands light on the reins, his posture relaxed yet perfectly aligned, and Eleanor felt a stirring of genuine admiration in her chest, the kind of recognition that passed between those who truly understood horses. The fashionable riders ahead of her had noticed him too, and a ripple of whispered excitement spread through the morning assembly like wind through wheat. The Duke of Ravenscroft, out riding. How extraordinary! The Viscountess's voice carried back, suddenly honeyed where it had been acid moments before. And still unwed these 2 years since the Duchess passed, though heaven knows every ambitious mamma in London has thrown her daughter at his head. He looks rather fierce this morning, does he not? Eleanor watched as the Duke guided his stallion past the cluster of admirers with barely a nod of acknowledgement, his expression remote, almost stern, though she thought she detected something weary in the set of his shoulders. His reputation preceded him like a cold wind, unapproachable, demanding, dismissive of society's frivolities, a man who had loved his wife deeply and had retreated behind walls of ice after her death. He was handsome in a severe way, all strong lines and dark intensity, his hair nearly black, and his eyes, even at this distance, sharp enough to cut. Eleanor told herself to look away, to attend to her mare who was growing restless, but something held her gaze, some quality in the way he rode that spoke to that part of her Thomas had nurtured, the part that understood the conversation between horse and rider. And then, as if he felt the weight of her observation, the Duke turned his head, and his eyes met hers across the misty expanse of the park. It lasted only a heartbeat, that moment of connection. But Eleanor felt it like a physical touch, a shock of recognition that made her breath catch. His expression flickered with something she could not name before his attention moved onward, and he continued down the row, leaving Eleanor suddenly aware of her racing pulse. She turned her mare away, certain she had imagined any particular notice, for what would a duke see in a woman like her? A spinster relegated to the margins, invisible to men of consequence. Yet her hands trembled slightly on the reins, and the morning suddenly felt different, charged with a possibility she dared not name. Eleanor had decided to give her mare her head, to let the animal stretch into the canter she had been requesting all morning, and she had just loosened the reins when a mail coach came rattling around the bend with reckless speed, the driver shouting and the horses wild-eyed. Her chestnut mare reared with a scream of terror, and Eleanor felt herself slipping, her seat compromised, her hands scrambling for purchase as the world tilted dangerously. And then another horse was there, the black stallion moving with impossible swiftness, and strong hands reached out to steady her mare's bridle, a calm voice cutting through the chaos with absolute authority. "Easy now, steady," the voice commanded, and whether he spoke to the horses or to Eleanor herself she could not say, but the effect was immediate. Her mare settled, trembling but no longer panicked, and Eleanor found herself looking directly into the face of the Duke of Ravenscroft from a distance of perhaps 2 feet, close enough to see that his eyes were not black as she had thought, but a deep grey, like winter skies. "Are you injured, miss?" he asked, and his voice held genuine concern rather than the polite indifference she would have expected from a man of his station. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, though whether from the near accident or his proximity she could not determine. "I am quite well, Your Grace. Thank you," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "You have excellent instincts, both of you. Your mare is well trained, and you kept your seat admirably under difficult circumstances." The compliment, so unexpected and specific, sent warmth flooding through her chest. "She is my greatest treasure," Eleanor said simply, stroking her mare's neck with a gloved hand. "My brother taught me that a good horse deserves a rider who will not fail them in moments of crisis." Something shifted in the Duke's expression, a softening around his eyes that transformed his stern features into something almost approachable. "Your brother sounds like a man of wisdom," he said quietly. "He was," Eleanor replied, and found herself adding, "He died 5 years ago, but I carry his lessons with me every time I ride." She did not know what possessed her to share such a personal truth with this formidable stranger, but the words emerged naturally, without the simpering deflection she heard other women employ in the presence of powerful men. The Duke held her gaze for a long moment, and Eleanor saw recognition there, the acknowledgement of shared grief, perhaps, or simply the respect of one skilled rider for another. "Then you honor him well, miss," he said, and released her mare's bridle, his hands returning to his own reins with practiced grace. "I trust you will have no further difficulties this morning." He inclined his head with perfect courtesy, and Eleanor found herself responding with equal formality. "Thank you, Your Grace, for your timely intervention." But even as the proper words left her lips, she felt the inadequacy of society's prescribed responses, wanted, somehow to convey the depth of her gratitude for his kindness. He seemed to understand, for his expression warmed fractionally before he turned his stallion and continued down the path, leaving Eleanor sitting motionless on her trembling mare, her entire body alive with an awareness she had never experienced before. The ballroom at Pemberton House blazed with candlelight that evening, crystal chandeliers scattering prisms across silk gowns and jeweled throats, and Eleanor stood in her designated corner beside Mrs. Weatherby and Lady Thornton, two widows of advanced years who had long ago resigned themselves to the role of chaperone and observer. Her gown was perfectly respectable, a pale blue silk that had been fashionable 3 seasons prior, altered twice to accommodate changing styles, but never quite achieving the graceful lines of the current mode, and she had long since ceased caring whether anyone noticed her at all. This was her function now, to provide her sister Lady Pemberton with the appearance of family support, while remaining sufficiently invisible so as not to draw attention to her unmarried state. Catherine had made her feelings abundantly clear during Eleanor's dressing, her pretty face arranged in an expression of sisterly concern that fooled neither of them. "I do wish you would make some effort, Eleanor," she had said, gesturing vaguely at Eleanor's simple coiffure and unadorned throat. "You are 26, not ancient, and if you would only soften your manner and show some interest in accomplishments beyond horses, perhaps some gentleman of modest expectations might still be persuaded." Eleanor had smiled tightly and thanked her sister for her concern, swallowing the observation that Catherine herself had been married at 19 to a wealthy viscount and therefore understood nothing of what it meant to be perpetually overlooked. Now, standing against the pale blue wallpaper while the young and beautiful danced past in swirls of white muslin and rose-water perfume, Eleanor felt the familiar weight of resignation settle over her shoulders like a shawl. She caught fragments of conversation drifting from a nearby cluster of matrons, Viscountess Ashford's carrying voice unmistakable in its cultivated cruelty. The elder Miss Hartley, yes, quite on the shelf now. Such a pity, though one cannot say it is surprising given her unfortunate tendency toward unfeminine pursuits. I am told she rides like a man and speaks her opinions as though anyone wishes to hear them. Lady Pemberton is a saint for continuing to bring her into society. Eleanor kept her expression serene, her hands folded loosely before her, having learned years ago that any visible reaction to such remarks only provided additional entertainment for those who delivered them. Mrs. Weatherby patted her arm with surprising gentleness, a silent gesture of solidarity that Eleanor appreciated more than she could express. The musicians began a new set, violins soaring into a waltz, and Eleanor was preparing to suggest she fetch refreshments, anything to occupy herself usefully, when a ripple of heightened attention swept through the ballroom like wind before a storm. She looked up to see the cause, and her breath caught in her throat. The Duke of Ravenscroft had arrived, moving through the entrance with that same commanding presence he had displayed on horseback that morning, and every eye in the room turned toward him with calculations written plainly across eager faces. The Duke moved through the crowd with the unconscious authority of a man accustomed to deference, his evening dress immaculate in black and white severity that only emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the austere planes of his face. And within moments he was surrounded by a fluttering constellation of young ladies in pale gowns, their mammas positioning them with the strategic precision of military commanders deploying troops. Eleanor watched from her corner with detached observation, noting how Miss Caroline Beaumont, widely acknowledged as the season's reigning beauty, maneuvered herself directly into his path with a practiced stumble that required his steadying hand, her golden ringlets and porcelain complexion displayed to perfection in the candlelight. The Duke responded with impeccable courtesy, his expression politely attentive but revealing nothing of his thoughts, and Eleanor felt a familiar mixture of sympathy and resignation, wondering what it must be like to never know whether people sought your company or merely your title and fortune. She was turning to suggest to Mrs. Weatherby that they repair to the refreshment room when she felt the weight of observation and looked up instinctively to find the Duke of Ravenscroft gazing directly at her across the expanse of polished floor and swirling dancers, his grey eyes unmistakable even at this distance. Her breath caught in surprise, certain she must be mistaken, but he inclined his head in clear acknowledgement, and before Eleanor could process the implications of this public recognition, he was excusing himself from the cluster of debutantes and moving toward her with deliberate purpose. Panic and exhilaration warred in her chest as whispers erupted around the ballroom like wildfire, heads turning to follow his progress, and then he was standing before her, bowing with the same formal grace he had displayed that morning. "Miss Hartley, I trust your mare suffered no lasting distress from this morning's excitement," he said, his voice carrying clearly enough that those nearby could hear every word. Eleanor's mind raced, aware that every syllable of this exchange would be dissected and analysed before the evening concluded. "She is quite recovered, Your Grace. Thank you for your concern," Eleanor replied, proud that her voice emerged steady despite her racing heart. "I confess I find equestrian pursuits far more agreeable than social assemblies, though I suppose one cannot spend every hour on horseback, no matter how appealing the prospect." She had not meant to be so forthright, the words escaping before propriety could censor them, and she braced herself for his polite withdrawal, but instead something remarkable happened. The Duke of Ravenscroft smiled, not the practiced social expression she had seen him offer the debutantes, but a genuine smile that transformed his stern features entirely, and reached his eyes with unmistakable warmth. "I find myself in complete agreement, Miss Hartley," he said, and there was amusement in his tone that felt like shared conspiracy. "One can dress a ballroom in silk and call it civilization, but it remains a rather elaborate form of marketplace, does it not?" His candour shocked her into a startled laugh, quickly suppressed, and she saw answering humour in his expression as he continued. "I wonder if you might do me the honour of walking with me tomorrow morning in Hyde Park, at whatever hour you typically ride. I should be most interested to hear your thoughts on matters equestrian without the distractions of society's theatre." Eleanor stared at him, certain she had misheard, but his expression remained steady and expectant, and around them she could feel the weight of scandalized fascination. Catherine's face across the room, a study in bewildered alarm. "Yes," she heard herself say, her heart beating wildly against her stays. "I should like that very much, Your Grace." Eleanor arrived at Hyde Park as the first pale gold light of dawn touched the treetops, the air cool and clean with that peculiar clarity that belongs only to early morning, before the city fully wakes. And she urged her mare forward along the familiar paths with a sense of liberation that no ballroom could ever provide. Here, with dew still clinging to the grass and bird-song replacing the artificial chatter of society, she could breathe fully and feel like herself rather than the disappointing spinster her world had labelled her, and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats beneath her became a kind of meditation that quieted all the anxious questions Catherine had peppered her with over breakfast. "What could the Duke possibly want with you, Eleanor? Do be careful not to presume too much. It was likely mere politeness, and you must not read significance into simple courtesy." But Eleanor had seen something in his eyes last night that transcended mere politeness, a recognition that felt like being seen for the first time in years, and whether it led anywhere beyond this morning's ride mattered less than the simple gift of being acknowledged as a person rather than an inconvenient reminder of unfulfilled expectations. She rounded the bend near the Serpentine and saw him waiting beneath an ancient oak, his black stallion standing quiet as a statue, and the Duke himself turned at the sound of her approach with an expression that could only be called welcoming. The formality of the ballroom fell away as naturally as leaves in autumn, and when she drew alongside him, he smiled with that same genuine warmth that had so surprised her the previous evening. "I wondered if you might reconsider in the cold light of morning, Miss Hartley," he said, his voice carrying a note of humour that transformed his austere features. "Society will have much to say about a young lady meeting a gentleman unchaperoned at such an hour." Eleanor felt an answering smile tug at her lips despite herself, surprised by her own boldness as she replied, "I rather think society has already said everything it intends to about me, Your Grace, and found me quite beyond redemption. I see little point in constraining myself further for an audience that has already rendered its verdict." He laughed then, a genuine sound of delight that seemed to startle him as much as it did her, and gestured toward the path ahead. "Shall we ride, then, and leave society to its pronouncements?" They moved forward together at an easy canter, the morning light strengthening around them and gilding everything with promise, and Eleanor felt the last of her defensive guardedness begin to soften as he asked her about her mare's breeding and training, with the focused interest of someone who genuinely cared about the answer, rather than merely filling silence with acceptable conversation. She found herself speaking freely about her late brother Thomas, who had taught her to ride, about the country estate where she had spent her childhood before her father's finances forced them to let it go, about the particular joy of feeling a horse respond to guidance rather than compulsion, and the Duke listened with an attention that felt like a gift, occasionally asking questions that revealed his own deep understanding of equestrian matters and his appreciation for the partnership between horse and rider that transcended mere mastery. The conversation flowed between them with an ease that Eleanor had not experienced in years, perhaps ever, and when the Duke remarked upon the particularly fine handling her mare demonstrated around a cluster of early morning nursemaids with prams, Eleanor found herself emboldened by the genuine interest in his voice to observe that speed was perhaps even more impressive than control, though she understood not all riders valued velocity over mere appearance. The Duke raised an eyebrow at this, his expression shifting into something that might have been challenge, or perhaps simple curiosity, and he asked whether she considered herself a judge of speed from observation alone or from experience. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, but refused to retreat from her own assertion, replying with more confidence than she felt that she had been racing her brother through their country fields since she was 12 years old, and knew perfectly well the difference between a horse with genuine speed and one that merely looked impressive, standing still. Something flickered in the Duke's grey eyes then, an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how alone they were on this path, how improper this entire encounter would appear to anyone who discovered it, but he did not look scandalized or disapproving, instead leaning forward slightly in his saddle with unmistakable interest. "I suspect your mare has considerable speed when given her head, Miss Hartley, but I wonder whether she could match my midnight over a quarter-mile." It was not quite a challenge, not quite a boast, delivered in a tone that suggested he was testing something, though Eleanor could not imagine what, and she felt her competitive spirit rise within her chest like a bird taking flight. That part of herself she had learned to suppress in drawing rooms, and at dinner parties suddenly given permission to exist. She met his gaze directly, her chin lifting in unconscious defiance of every lesson in feminine modesty she had ever received, and heard herself say with perfect clarity that she would be delighted to discover the answer to that question if His Grace was not concerned about the possibility of defeat at the hands of a mere spinster on an unfashionable mare. The Duke went very still for a moment, and Eleanor wondered with sudden panic if she had overstepped catastrophically, if this fragile connection would shatter under the weight of her unseemly boldness. But then he smiled, that transformative, genuine smile that made him look years younger and infinitely more approachable. "Tomorrow morning then, Miss Hartley, same hour, and we shall settle this question of speed empirically," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to wrap around her like sunlight. From the oak tree to the far gate, a fair distance to prove the matter conclusively. Eleanor felt her heart hammering against her ribs, exhilaration and terror warring within her, and she nodded her agreement before wisdom could intervene, already wondering what madness had possessed her to challenge a duke to a horse race, but unable to regret the spark of excitement that burned away the grey resignation she had carried for so long. Eleanor returned to the Hartley townhouse with her heart still racing and her mind spinning with the impossibility of what she had just agreed to. A horse race with the Duke of Ravenscroft at dawn tomorrow, as though she were still a hoydenish girl, racing through country fields rather than a 26-year-old spinster who should know better than to court scandal and ridicule. She had barely removed her riding habit before Catherine appeared in her doorway with an expression that promised interrogation, and Eleanor braced herself for the inevitable sisterly concern that would sound remarkably like criticism dressed in solicitude. "You were gone a terribly long time this morning, Eleanor," Catherine began with that particular tone that indicated she had been rehearsing her speech while waiting. "I do hope you were not anywhere you might be observed behaving in a manner that could reflect poorly on our family." Eleanor felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always accompanied these conversations, the weight of being perpetually disappointing simply by existing as herself. But before she could formulate a sufficiently vague response, the truth spilled out almost defiantly. "I have agreed to race the Duke of Ravenscroft tomorrow morning in Hyde Park, from the oak tree to the far gate, and I intend to win." The silence that followed was so complete that Eleanor could hear the mantel clock ticking in the drawing room below, and Catherine's face cycled through expressions of disbelief, horror, and something that might have been envy before settling on scandalized concern. "Eleanor, you cannot possibly be serious, racing through a public park like some common stable hand. What will people say? What will the Duke think of you? Surely you misunderstood his intention." But Eleanor had not misunderstood. She was certain of that. And the memory of his smile when he accepted her challenge warmed something inside her that years of social dismissal had frozen into resigned numbness. "I understood him perfectly well, Catherine, and he understood me, which is more than most of society has managed in all the years we have been in London." Meanwhile, across the city in his Mayfair study, William Blackwood sat opposite his closest friend, Lord Marcus Sinclair, and attempted to explain why he had just arranged an improper dawn meeting with a woman society had thoroughly dismissed as unmarriageable. Marcus listened with growing amusement as William described Eleanor's spirit and authenticity, the way she spoke about horses with genuine passion rather than affected interest, the challenge in her eyes when she questioned whether his stallion could match her mare's speed. "She is not at all what I expected," William admitted, running his hand through his hair in a gesture that betrayed unusual agitation. "There is nothing calculated or performative about her, no simpering attempts to charm or impress, just honest engagement with the world as she finds it." Marcus leaned back with a knowing smile and observed that this sounded remarkably like admiration, perhaps even something more. And surely William was not planning to actually race the woman, but merely engage in some courtly pretense of competition. The dawn arrived cool and silver, the sky above Hyde Park painted in those delicate shades that exist only in the hour before London truly wakes. And Eleanor stood beside her mare at the designated oak tree, with her heart beating so loudly she was certain it could be heard across the empty paths. She had dressed in her most practical riding habit, dark blue wool that allowed maximum movement, and had braided her hair with ruthless efficiency to keep it secure beneath her hat, every preparation made with the focus of a soldier preparing for battle rather than a woman embarking on an improper dawn adventure. The park was blessedly empty, save for a single groundskeeper in the distance who took no notice of her, and the grass still held the morning dew that would make the ground just slightly treacherous, requiring even greater skill from both horse and rider. Eleanor ran her hand along her mare's neck, feeling the warmth and power beneath the sleek coat, whispering encouragement that was as much for herself as for the animal, trying to calm the mixture of excitement and terror that threatened to overwhelm her practical intentions. Then she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the direction of the south entrance, steady and unhurried, and turned to see the Duke of Ravenscroft emerging from the morning mist like some figure from legend, his black stallion Midnight moving with the fluid grace of water flowing downhill. He was dressed simply for riding, no unnecessary ornamentation, and the sight of him sent a flutter through her stomach that had nothing to do with competitive nerves, and everything to do with the way he looked at her as he approached, as though she were the only person who existed in all of London. "Good morning, Miss Hartley," he said as he drew alongside her, his voice carrying warmth despite the coolness of the air. "I confess I wondered whether wisdom might prevail, and I would find myself standing here alone." Eleanor lifted her chin, refusing to acknowledge how close she had come to precisely that outcome, and replied that she was not in the habit of issuing challenges she did not intend to honor, however improper they might appear to others. Something flickered in his eyes then, approval or admiration, or perhaps something deeper, and he nodded once before guiding Midnight into position beside her mare. The distance stretched before them, perhaps a quarter-mile to the far gate that was visible as a dark silhouette against the gradually lightening sky, and Eleanor felt every nerve in her body come alive with anticipation. "Shall we begin on the count of 3?" the Duke suggested, and Eleanor agreed, gathering her reins with hands that trembled only slightly, every lesson her brother had ever taught her about balance and speed, and reading the ground rushing back through her memory. The Duke began the count, his voice steady and clear in the quiet morning. 1, 2. And on 3, Eleanor gave her mare the signal to run, feeling the immediate surge of power as the animal leaped forward with the joy of speed that all horses possess when given permission to truly move. The wind rushed past Eleanor's face as her mare stretched into full stride, powerful and smooth, and for several glorious strides she was aware of nothing but the thunder of hooves and the perfect harmony between rider and horse that her brother had taught her to achieve through patience and trust. Then peripheral awareness returned, and she sensed rather than saw the Duke's stallion matching her pace just slightly behind, close enough that she could hear Midnight's breathing and the rhythm of his hooves striking the dewy grass, and competitive determination surged through her veins alongside the pure joy of speed. William Blackwood felt Midnight's eagerness to overtake, the stallion's powerful muscles bunching with the desire to demonstrate his superiority, and for a moment he allowed himself to consider it. The satisfaction of winning that had driven him through so many competitions in his younger years before grief and responsibility had dampened all such simple pleasures. But then he glanced sideways at Eleanor and saw something that struck him with unexpected force, the absolute transformation of her entire being in this moment of unrestrained freedom. All the careful social armor stripped away to reveal a woman radiant with genuine joy. Her face glowed with exertion and exhilaration, her eyes bright and focused on the distant gate, her posture perfect not from practiced deportment, but from natural skill, and she leaned into the speed with a trust in her horse and herself that spoke of countless hours of practice and genuine partnership. This was who she truly was beneath the resignation and dismissal, this fearless, spirited woman who challenged dukes and raced through parks at dawn without artifice or calculation, and William felt something shift irrevocably in his chest as he watched her pull slightly ahead. The decision formed without conscious thought, a subtle signal to Midnight to ease just a fraction, nothing that would appear intentional to any observer, but enough to allow Eleanor's mare to extend her lead by a length, then 2. He told himself it was strategy, allowing her to feel the victory would make their next encounter easier. But the truth resonated deeper in that space where he had been numb for 2 years. He wanted desperately to see her win, to witness the joy that would light her face when she crossed that finish line, knowing she had triumphed. The far gate approached rapidly, and Eleanor was fully focused on the final stretch, unaware of the gift being given, her mare responding beautifully to her guidance as they surged forward with everything the animal possessed. William held Midnight steady, maintaining the gap, close enough that the race appeared genuine, but far enough that Eleanor's victory was assured, and as she flashed past the gate marker 3 lengths ahead, he felt his heart constrict at the sound of her triumphant laugh echoing across the empty park. She slowed her mare gradually with expert handling, circling back toward him with her face absolutely radiant, unself-conscious in her delight. And William knew with absolute certainty as he watched her approach that this woman, dismissed and overlooked by everyone who mattered in society, mattered more to him in this single moment than anything had mattered in years. Eleanor brought her mare to a complete halt beside the Duke, her breath coming in rapid gasps that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with the exhilaration coursing through her entire body like liquid light, and she could not contain the smile that spread across her face with such unrestrained delight that she felt almost dizzy with it. "I won," she said unnecessarily, her voice breathless and wondering, as though she could not quite believe what had just occurred, despite the evidence of her position ahead of him at the finish line. The Duke guided Midnight closer, his own breathing elevated from the ride, though he appeared far more composed than she felt, and the expression on his face arrested her attention completely because it held none of the frustration or wounded pride she might have expected from a man who had just been bested by a woman in the activity where men presumed their natural superiority. Instead, his eyes held that warmth, and something else she could not quite name, a softness that made her suddenly intensely aware of how she must appear with her hair escaping its braid, and her cheeks flushed, and her entire person in a state of dishevelment that would horrify her sister. "You did indeed, Miss Hartley," he said, and his voice carried genuine pleasure rather than polite courtesy. "That was magnificent riding, truly exceptional, and your mare responded to you beautifully." Eleanor felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the race, unused to such sincere praise from anyone beyond her late brother, and she reached forward to pat her mare's neck while searching for words that would not reveal how much his approval affected her. "She is a wonderful partner," Eleanor managed, her voice steadier now, as she focused on the familiar subject of horses rather than the unfamiliar sensation of being seen and appreciated. "My brother taught me that riding is not about dominance, but partnership, about trust and communication between horse and rider." The Duke nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving her face, and said that her brother must have been an excellent teacher to produce such skill, and he spoke with such genuine respect that Eleanor felt the familiar ache of grief mixed now with gratitude that someone understood what those lessons had meant to her. They sat there on their horses as the sun climbed higher and the park began to show signs of other early visitors in the distance, and Eleanor became gradually aware that something had shifted between them in a way she could not quite articulate. Some barrier had dissolved during that wild race through the morning. "I confess I expected you to be less gracious in defeat," Eleanor said before she could stop herself, then immediately wished she could recall the words that seemed far too familiar for a woman of her position addressing a duke. William laughed, a genuine sound of amusement that transformed his usually severe features, and replied that he had learned through bitter experience that there were far more important things in life than winning races, and that witnessing her joy at her victory was worth more than any triumph of his own could provide. Eleanor stared at him, trying to decipher whether he was simply being polite or whether he truly meant such an extraordinary statement, and as their eyes met and held, she felt something flutter to life in her chest that she had thought long dead, a fragile hope that perhaps this man saw something in her beyond what society deemed her worth. By noon of that same day, the news of the race had spread through London society with the speed and fervor that only truly scandalous information could achieve, carried from drawing room to drawing room by servants and visitors until it seemed that every person of consequence had heard some version of the tale of Miss Eleanor Hartley racing the Duke of Ravenscroft through Hyde Park at dawn like some wild creature utterly heedless of propriety. Eleanor learned of her sudden notoriety when her sister arrived at the Hartley residence in a state of agitation that would have been comical had Eleanor not understood the genuine social peril such gossip could create, and Lady Pemberton swept into the morning room with her face flushed and her reticule swinging dangerously as she demanded to know what Eleanor had been thinking to engage in such spectacularly improper behavior with a man of the Duke's standing. The lecture continued for some time with predictions of complete social ruin and lamentations about how Eleanor's recklessness would reflect upon the entire family. But beneath her sister's distress, Eleanor detected something else, a bewildered confusion that the Duke had participated willingly and even appeared to have enjoyed himself rather than treating the incident as an imposition by an insignificant woman. Across London, in more fashionable drawing rooms, the reactions varied wildly according to the disposition and allegiances of those discussing the matter, and Viscountess Ashford held court in her elegant salon, pronouncing with cutting precision that Miss Hartley had obviously thrown herself at the Duke in the most unsubtle manner imaginable, using her one dubious skill to force his attention through sheer audacity when every proper avenue remained closed to a woman of her limited attractions and advancing years. Several of the younger ladies present nodded agreement, though their expressions held more envy than righteousness, for the Duke's attention was a prize they had all sought without success, and the idea that Eleanor Hartley had somehow captured his interest through a horse race seemed both unfair and vaguely threatening to the established social order. Yet other voices rose in unexpected defence, for Lord Marcus Sinclair made certain to mention at his club that the Duke had spoken of the race with genuine enthusiasm and respect for Miss Hartley's exceptional riding skill, and several gentlemen who had observed the finish from a distance confirmed that both parties had appeared thoroughly pleased with the morning's entertainment. By evening, when Eleanor reluctantly accompanied her father to a musical performance at the Bellingham residence, she could feel the weight of attention upon her the moment she entered, conversations pausing and heads turning with expressions ranging from disapproval to fascination to something approaching respect from those who secretly admired her courage. Then the Duke himself arrived, and the room fell into a silence so complete that the rustle of fabric seemed thunderous, and every eye watched as he crossed directly to where Eleanor stood, frozen beside a pillar, trying to appear smaller than she was. "Miss Hartley," he said with perfect courtesy, and no hint of embarrassment. "I trust you and your mare suffered no ill effects from our exhilarating morning exercise," and his use of the word "our" rather than "your" made clear to everyone present that he claimed equal participation and responsibility for the scandalous race. In the days that followed the musical performance, the shift in the Duke of Ravenscroft's behaviour toward Eleanor became impossible for society to ignore or dismiss as mere courtesy, for he began appearing at events he had previously avoided with a regularity that suggested deliberate intent, and his attention invariably sought her out, regardless of where she had positioned herself in the room, or how many more suitable young ladies vied for his notice. At the Thornbury afternoon reception, he spent 20 minutes in conversation with Eleanor about the relative merits of various riding paths through the countryside, while Miss Caroline Beaumont stood nearby with a smile frozen on her beautiful face and fury blazing in her eyes. And when Lady Pemberton hosted a small dinner party, the Duke accepted an invitation he might once have declined and requested that he be seated near Miss Hartley so that they might continue a discussion about equine training methods they had begun at a previous encounter. Society watched this unprecedented attention with reactions ranging from scandalized disapproval to fascinated speculation, for the Duke had shown no interest in any woman since his wife's death 2 years prior, and that he should now focus his regard upon Eleanor Hartley, of all people, seemed to defy every expectation and assumption about how such matters were supposed to unfold. The gossips worked themselves into a frenzy, trying to explain this incomprehensible development, with some suggesting that the Duke had taken pity on the poor spinster, while others whispered that Eleanor must have employed some form of cunning manipulation to ensnare his attention, but none could adequately account for the genuine warmth in his expression when he looked at her, or the way he actually listened when she spoke, rather than merely waiting for his turn to talk. Caroline Beaumont's response to this threat moved beyond jealousy into active manoeuvring, and she made certain to position herself near the Duke whenever possible, while making subtly disparaging remarks about women who forgot their proper place and engaged in unladylike pursuits, comments clearly aimed at Eleanor, though never naming her directly. Yet the Duke seemed impervious to these attempts, responding to Caroline's pointed observations with cool politeness that held none of the warmth he showed when addressing Eleanor, and on one memorable occasion he interrupted a particularly barbed comment about propriety to observe that he found genuine passion for one's interests far more appealing than studied performance of what others deemed appropriate. Eleanor herself moved through these days in a state of confused hope that she barely dared acknowledge even in her most private thoughts. For years of dismissal had taught her to expect disappointment, and she could not quite believe that a man of the Duke's position would truly see anything of value in a woman society had long since written off as unmarriageable. Yet he kept appearing, kept seeking her company, kept looking at her with an expression that made her heart race and her careful resignation crumble bit by bit beneath the weight of possibility. Even Lady Pemberton's attitude began to shift from patronizing concern to bewildered reassessment, for she could not deny the evidence before her eyes that the Duke of Ravenscroft was actively pursuing her elder sister's company, and the social implications of such attention forced a recalibration of Eleanor's worth in the calculus of family standing. The garden party at the Pemberton estate took place on an afternoon when June sunlight filtered through ancient oak trees and illuminated the carefully cultivated roses that Lady Pemberton had spent considerable resources perfecting for just such occasions, and Eleanor moved through the gathering with the strange sensation of being simultaneously more visible and more uncertain than she had ever been in her life. The Duke had arrived precisely at the hour indicated on the invitation, and had made his intentions unmistakably clear by seeking Eleanor out within moments of his entrance, offering his arm and requesting the pleasure of her company for a walk through the gardens, with a courtesy that was also somehow a claim that left no room for the other guests to misunderstand his purpose. They walked together along paths bordered by lavender and honeysuckle, while behind them Eleanor could feel the weight of watching eyes, and knew that every gesture and word would be reported and analysed in drawing-rooms across London before nightfall. But the Duke seemed entirely unconcerned with their audience as he guided her toward the more secluded eastern section where a stone bench sat beneath a pergola heavy with climbing roses. He asked her about the flowers, and she answered with the knowledge she had gained from years of tending her father's modest gardens, and then somehow the conversation shifted as he inquired with genuine interest about where she had learned to ride with such exceptional skill, and Eleanor found herself speaking of her brother Thomas, who had died 4 years earlier from a fever that took him in less than a week. She had not intended to share something so personal and painful, but the Duke listened with an attention that invited honesty rather than performance, and she told him how Thomas had taught her to ride when she was 7 years old and he was 10, how they had spent every possible moment on horseback exploring the countryside around their estate, how he had treated her as an equal rather than a delicate creature who needed protection from adventure. Her voice wavered slightly as she explained that riding was the place where she still felt closest to her brother, where his memory lived not as grief, but as joy, and she looked down at her hands rather than meet the Duke's eyes, because she had revealed far more vulnerability than she had intended, and feared she would see pity in his expression. Instead, when she finally gathered the courage to look up, she found his face marked with understanding that held no condescension, and he told her quietly that he knew something of loss and the particular ache of continuing to live in a world that no longer contained someone who had helped define who you were. He spoke briefly of his late wife, not with the romanticized sorrow that society expected, but with honest acknowledgement of complicated grief, and in that moment beneath the roses, Eleanor felt the walls she had built around her heart begin to crack, because here was someone who did not require her to pretend that loss was simple, or that strength meant never feeling pain. The Duke was silent for a long moment after they had shared these pieces of grief that had shaped them, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made Eleanor understand he was about to tell her something significant, something that would shift the ground between them in ways she could not yet anticipate. He said that he had been living for 2 years in a kind of half-existence, where he performed the duties required of his position, while feeling utterly disconnected from everything and everyone around him, surrounded constantly by people, yet profoundly alone, because no one spoke to him with honesty, or saw him as anything beyond his title and wealth. Then he told her that watching her race through Hyde Park that morning had been the first time since his wife's death that he had felt truly present in a moment, that her joy had been so genuine and unguarded that it had pierced through the numbness he had wrapped around himself, and Eleanor listened with growing astonishment as he continued speaking with an openness that seemed to cost him something. He said he had a confession to make about that race, and her heart began to beat faster because his expression held both vulnerability and something that looked almost like nervousness. And then he told her plainly that he had let her win, that his horse could have outpaced hers easily, but that he had deliberately held back because her happiness had seemed more important than his victory. Eleanor felt a flash of indignation rise in her chest, because she had believed she had earned that triumph through skill, and now he was telling her it had been a gift she had not asked for. But before she could give voice to her injured pride, he reached out and placed his hand gently over hers where it rested on the stone bench. He explained that he had not done it out of pity or condescension, but because in that moment he had wanted nothing more than to see her smile with that unrestrained joy, that giving her that victory had brought him more satisfaction than winning ever could have. And as Eleanor looked into his eyes, she saw the truth of what he was really saying beneath the words about the race. He was telling her that he saw her, truly saw her, not as society's overlooked spinster, but as someone whose happiness mattered to him, someone worth making sacrifices for, someone he wanted to please, not out of obligation, but from genuine regard. Her indignation melted away as understanding bloomed in its place, and she realized that his letting her win had not diminished her skill or taken anything from her, but had instead been an offering, a declaration made before he himself had fully understood what it meant. She turned her hand beneath his so that their palms touched, and she told him quietly that she understood why he had done it, and in the garden filled with roses and afternoon sunlight, something unspoken but profound passed between them as their fingers intertwined, and neither moved away. The fragile understanding that had bloomed between Eleanor and the Duke in the garden at Pemberton Estate might have continued growing into something neither could deny had Viscountess Ashford not decided that the spectacle of Miss Eleanor Hartley attracting the attention of the Duke of Ravenscroft represented both a personal affront and a dangerous disruption to the natural social order that required immediate correction. Within 2 days of the garden party, the whispers began circulating through drawing rooms and at morning calls with the insidious persistence of poison seeping through cracks, and the Viscountess demonstrated considerable skill in the art of destroying reputations through carefully constructed insinuation rather than direct accusation. She spoke with wide eyes and a concerned tone about poor Miss Hartley, who seemed determined to make a spectacle of herself, despite the kindness of those who tried to guide her toward more appropriate behavior, and she wondered aloud with false sympathy what desperation might drive a woman of Eleanor's age and limited prospects to pursue a duke with such obvious calculation. The word calculation appeared repeatedly in these conversations, always delivered with a delicate emphasis that transformed Eleanor's genuine warmth into something grasping and artificial, and the Viscountess proved particularly effective at reframing the race in Hyde Park from an eccentric amusement into evidence of Eleanor's willingness to abandon propriety in her campaign to secure a titled husband. Other voices joined the chorus, because cruelty often finds eager participants among those who fear becoming its next target, and soon Eleanor could not enter a room without feeling the weight of speculation and judgment that followed her like a cold draught. The Duke became aware of the gossip during a visit to his club, where he overheard a conversation that spoke of Eleanor with such casual dismissiveness that his response was immediate and glacial, and the gentlemen who had been laughing about the absurdity of the Duke showing interest in such an unsuitable woman found themselves subjected to a verbal dissection delivered in tones that could freeze wine. He made his position unmistakably clear through both words and the social influence he rarely bothered to wield. But even a duke cannot entirely silence determined gossips who simply become more circumspect about where and how they spread their poison. Eleanor herself became aware of the full extent of the campaign against her when she attended a musical evening at the home of a distant cousin and arrived early enough to overhear a conversation taking place in an adjacent room where Viscountess Ashford held court. The words drifted through the partially open door with perfect clarity as the Viscountess explained to her audience that the Duke was obviously indulging in a temporary diversion with Miss Hartley, that men of his rank sometimes entertained themselves with inappropriate women before returning to their senses and choosing suitable brides, and that it was really quite sad to watch Miss Hartley mistake polite attention for genuine regard when everyone knew that a duke would never actually offer marriage to someone so utterly beneath his station. Eleanor stood frozen in the hallway with her heart turning to stone in her chest, as another voice added that the Duke was probably simply lonely, and Miss Hartley had made herself available in ways that more respectable women would not. And the laughter that followed this observation held a cruelty that made Eleanor feel physically ill. Eleanor retreated from the musical evening without entering the main room and spent the following 3 days declining invitations and avoiding all social engagements while constructing in her mind a careful plan to extract herself from whatever connection had been forming between herself and the Duke before his reputation could be further damaged by association with her. She understood with painful clarity that the whispers would only grow louder if he continued to show her attention, that eventually even his rank would not protect him from the speculation that he had lost his judgment or fallen victim to manipulation by an unsuitable woman, and she cared for him too much to allow her presence in his life to become a source of mockery or diminishment. The Duke noticed her absence immediately and made inquiries through Lady Pemberton, who provided vague excuses about Eleanor being unwell or occupied with family matters, and his confusion turned to concern when he called at the Pemberton house only to be told that Miss Hartley was not receiving visitors. On the 4th day of Eleanor's withdrawal, he arrived at the Hartley family home in the late afternoon with his patience exhausted, and his concern sharpening into something closer to fear that she had been hurt or taken ill. And when the housekeeper showed him into the modest drawing room, he found Eleanor standing near the window with her posture rigid and her expression carefully composed. She turned as he entered, and he saw immediately that she was not ill in body, but that something had altered in her bearing, something that reminded him painfully of the resignation he had first observed in her before the race. And when she greeted him with formal politeness that erected walls where there had been growing intimacy, he felt anger rise in his chest, though not at her. He asked directly what had happened to cause her to disappear from society and from his company without explanation. And Eleanor had rehearsed what she meant to say, but found the words more difficult to deliver when faced with the genuine concern in his eyes and the tension in his shoulders that spoke of distress rather than mere curiosity. She told him carefully that she had come to understand that their friendship, however pleasant it had been for her, was causing him difficulties in society that he did not deserve, that people were speaking of him with speculation, and of her with assumptions that diminished them both, and that she believed the kindest course was to release him from any sense of obligation he might feel toward continuing their acquaintance. The Duke stared at her for a long moment, with an expression that moved from confusion to comprehension to something that looked remarkably like fury, though she sensed the anger was not directed at her, and when he spoke his voice was low and tight, with an emotion she could not entirely identify. He asked if she truly believed he was the sort of man who would allow the opinions of people like Viscountess Ashford to dictate his choice or abandon someone he valued because gossips found entertainment in tearing down what they could not understand, and Eleanor felt her careful composure begin to crack as he stepped closer. and told her with barely restrained frustration that she was not releasing him from obligation because he had never acted from obligation, but from regard that had grown into something far deeper than she apparently understood. Eleanor felt the careful walls she had constructed begin to crumble as the Duke continued speaking with an intensity that transformed the modest drawing room into a space that could barely contain the emotion building between them. He told her that from the moment he had watched her race through Hyde Park with joy illuminating her face, he had recognized something he thought lost to him forever. The possibility of connection with someone who did not perform or calculate, but simply existed with honest feeling, and he confessed that every conversation they had shared afterward only deepened his certainty that she possessed qualities he had spent years searching for among women who seemed crafted from the same lifeless mold of social expectation. Eleanor tried to interrupt, to explain that society would never accept such a union, that the difference in their stations would make her a target for cruelty that would reflect poorly on him. But he stepped closer and captured her hand in his with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the fierceness in his voice as he dismantled every objection she raised. He told her that society had already judged him when his first wife died, and he failed to mourn in ways that satisfied their expectations for grief, that gossips had called him cold and unfeeling, when in truth he had simply been numb with loneliness in a marriage that had been all propriety and no warmth, and that the opinions of people like Viscountess Ashford held no power over him because he had learned through loss that life was too brief to waste on pleasing those who would never be satisfied. His words came faster now as he explained that she misunderstood everything if she thought he had shown her attention from politeness or worse from the kind of temporary diversion that cruel tongues suggested, that what he felt was not obligation or passing amusement, but love, that had grown from admiration into something that consumed his thoughts and made the prospect of her absence unbearable. Eleanor felt tears spill down her cheeks as years of accumulated self-doubt collided with the reality of this man she had come to care for standing in her drawing room and speaking words she had never imagined hearing directed at herself. She whispered that she was not beautiful or accomplished or anything that a duke should want in a wife, and he made a sound of frustration before cupping her face in his hands and telling her with devastating sincerity that she was brave and genuine and kind, that she rode like she was born in the saddle and spoke like she had never learned to lie, that her smile when she won their race had been the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed because it was completely unguarded and real. He asked if she truly could not see that everything society dismissed in her was precisely what he valued most, and when she looked into his eyes and saw vulnerability matching her own, she understood with sudden clarity that he meant every word. Her voice broke as she confessed that she had loved him almost from the beginning, but had not dared hope he might return such feelings, and the smile that transformed his face held such relief and joy that she started to laugh even as tears continued falling. He kissed her then with a tenderness that spoke of reverence and longing combined, and Eleanor felt the years of resignation and invisibility fall away like discarded weight as she kissed him back and allowed herself to believe that she was truly seen and truly loved. When they finally drew apart, he asked her formally if she would consent to be his wife, and she answered yes with a certainty that left no room for doubt, and neither of them noticed her father standing frozen in the doorway with an expression of complete astonishment at finding a duke in his drawing room proposing to the daughter he had assumed would remain forever unwed. Mr. Hartley recovered from his initial shock with remarkable speed and granted his blessing with a bewilderment that suggested he had never quite understood his eldest daughter but was pleased to see her happy, and within hours the Duke had sent formal notices to the London papers announcing his engagement to Miss Eleanor Hartley of Hartley House, which created a sensation that rippled through drawing rooms and ballrooms across the city like a stone thrown into still water. The reactions ranged from genuine delight among those who had observed the Duke's marked preference and understood that he had chosen with deliberation, to stunned disbelief from those who had dismissed Eleanor as a permanent fixture among the unnoticed, to barely concealed fury from women like Caroline Beaumont, who had assumed the Duke would eventually settle on someone beautiful and accomplished in the traditional sense. Eleanor learned of the public response through her sister, who arrived at the Hartley home the morning after the announcement with an expression that mixed vindication with something approaching awe. And Lady Pemberton confessed with uncharacteristic humility that she had underestimated Eleanor and failed to see what the Duke had recognized immediately. The Duke himself seemed entirely unmoved by the speculation and gossip, appearing at Eleanor's side for morning rides in Hyde Park, where they were observed by crowds larger than usual, and his bearing communicated to anyone watching that he was not a man who had made an impulsive choice, but rather one who was completely certain of the woman he had selected. Lord Sinclair called at the Pemberton house during an afternoon when Eleanor was visiting, and expressed his hearty approval with a warmth that made Eleanor understand why the Duke valued his friendship, telling her that he had never seen his friend so genuinely content, and that she had accomplished what society's most celebrated beauties could not by simply being herself. Caroline Beaumont's response was less gracious, delivered at a musical where she approached Eleanor with a smile that failed to reach her eyes and remarked that the Duke must value novelty above all else, though her words fell flat when the Duke appeared at Eleanor's shoulder and guided her away with a possessive gentleness that announced his devotion to everyone present. Viscountess Ashford maintained a tight-lipped silence that was perhaps more telling than her usual cutting commentary, and Eleanor noticed that the woman who had once mocked her so freely now avoided direct interaction, as though uncertain how to navigate the social reality of Eleanor's transformation from overlooked spinster to future duchess. Eleanor found herself surprised by her own growing confidence, not in her appearance or accomplishments which remained unchanged, but in the certainty that she was loved by a man whose regard she valued above all others, and this knowledge created a foundation that allowed her to face society's mixed reactions with dignity, rather than the defensive resignation that had characterized her earlier responses to judgment. The Duke presented her with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother rather than his first wife, a square-cut sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught the light like captured sky, and when he slipped it onto her finger, he told her it reminded him of her eyes in the moment she won their race. The weeks leading to the wedding transformed Eleanor's experience of London society in ways she had never anticipated, not through any change in her appearance or behavior, but through the gradual shift in how others responded to her when the Duke of Ravenscroft stood visibly devoted at her side. They attended a series of social events together as an officially betrothed couple, and Eleanor found herself navigating ballrooms and drawing rooms with a confidence that sprang not from arrogance, but from the secure knowledge that she was genuinely loved by a man whose opinion mattered more to her than the collective judgment of the entire ton. The Duke seemed to take quiet satisfaction in remaining close to her throughout these events, his hand frequently finding the small of her back or his body positioning itself protectively when conversations grew awkward, and his visible devotion gradually altered the calculations of those who had previously dismissed her as insignificant. Lady Pemberton proved surprisingly helpful during the preparations, her earlier patronizing concern replaced by what appeared to be genuine happiness for her sister, and she confessed during a morning visit that she had spent years worrying Eleanor would be lonely, only to discover that Eleanor had been waiting for something real rather than settling for something convenient. Together they selected fabrics for Eleanor's wedding gown and discussed arrangements for the ceremony that would take place at the Ravenscroft Estate Chapel, and Eleanor felt a warmth toward her sister that had been buried under years of comparison and condescension. The Duke involved Eleanor in every decision about their future life together, asking her preferences about which of his estates she might prefer as their primary residence, and whether she wished to maintain the London house or limit their time in the city to the necessary minimum. These conversations revealed a man who viewed marriage as a partnership rather than an arrangement where the wife simply adapted to the husband's established patterns, and Eleanor discovered that he genuinely valued her, opinions on matters ranging from household management to the stewardship of his tenants. During one particularly meaningful discussion in the Pemberton garden, where they had stolen a few moments of relative privacy, the Duke asked Eleanor about her dreams beyond marriage itself, and when she hesitantly mentioned that she had always wished to establish a riding school for young women who lacked access to proper instruction, his immediate enthusiasm and offers of support made her understand that he intended to help her flourish rather than simply possess her. They spoke of children with a tentative hope that acknowledged the uncertainty of such blessings, and he told her that whether they were granted sons or daughters or no children at all, his commitment to her remained absolute because she was the gift he had not dared hope to find. The sapphire ring on her finger caught sunlight as they walked, and Eleanor touched it frequently, as though confirming the reality of her transformation from overlooked spinster to cherished bride. While across London the invitations to their wedding were received with reactions ranging from genuine joy to grudging acceptance, to the tight-lipped silence of those like Viscountess Ashford, who could not gracefully admit they had been wrong. The wedding took place on a June morning when the Ravenscroft estate chapel seemed to hold all the light and warmth that Eleanor's former life had lacked, and she moved through the preparations in a state of wonder that felt both dreamlike and more real than anything she had previously experienced. The chapel itself was a stone structure covered in climbing roses that released their perfume into air already sweet with summer, and inside the ancient building someone had arranged white lilies and garden flowers in a style that suggested natural abundance rather than formal artifice. Eleanor wore a gown of ivory silk that Lady Pemberton had helped select, simple in design but exquisitely made, and as her sister fastened the final buttons, she caught sight of her own reflection and saw not a transformation of her appearance, but rather a woman who finally looked as though she belonged in her own skin. The guests who gathered represented a careful selection of those who had shown genuine kindness or at least honest acceptance, and Eleanor felt gratitude that the Duke had understood her preference for a smaller ceremony among people whose goodwill was sincere rather than a grand spectacle designed to satisfy society's expectations. Mr. Hartley walked her down the aisle with a mixture of pride and bemusement still evident on his kind face, and Eleanor felt the weight of his hand on her arm as both blessing and farewell to the daughter he had never quite understood but had always gently loved. The Duke stood waiting at the altar in dark blue superfine that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, and when his eyes found hers, the expression on his face held such unveiled emotion that Eleanor felt tears threaten even as joy bloomed warm in her chest. The ceremony proceeded with traditional words that somehow felt entirely new when spoken with genuine intention, and when the Duke made his vows, his voice carried clearly through the chapel as he promised not just to honor and protect, but to cherish and celebrate the woman she was, rather than attempting to mold her into something more conventionally acceptable. Eleanor's own vows emerged steadier than she had expected, and she promised to stand beside him in both his public duties and his private solitude, to see him truly as he had seen her, and to build a life of authentic partnership rather than polite coexistence. Lord Sinclair served as witness with visible satisfaction, and even Lady Pemberton wept openly when the Duke kissed his new Duchess, with a tenderness that made clear this was no marriage of convenience, but rather a union of genuine devotion. The celebration that followed in the Ravenscroft Gardens felt like a gathering of true friends rather than a social obligation, and Eleanor moved through conversations without the defensive tension that had characterized her navigation of society, secure in the knowledge that the man whose ring she wore valued her exactly as she was, and that this wedding marked not an ending of her authentic self, but rather the beginning of a life where she could finally flourish. The Ravenscroft country estate revealed itself to Eleanor as something from a half-forgotten dream, all golden stone and climbing ivy and windows that caught the afternoon light as their carriage rolled up the curved drive, and she felt her husband's eyes on her face as she took in the sprawling beauty of what was now her home. William had insisted they spend the first weeks of their marriage here rather than at the London house, and Eleanor understood this as another gift, his desire to share with her the place he loved most without the constant observation of society's curious eyes. The estate stretched across rolling hills that held both cultivated parkland and wilder spaces where ancient oaks stood sentinel, and Eleanor felt something in her chest expand at the thought of exploring this landscape on horseback, with no concern for who might see or judge her enthusiasm. The Duke showed her through the house with visible pleasure, pointing out not the grand staterooms, but rather the smaller spaces he thought she might love, a library with windows overlooking the rose garden, a morning room that caught the eastern light, and finally the rooms that would be hers to arrange as she wished. There was a tenderness in how he presented each space, watching her reactions, and Eleanor realized he was nervous in a way she had never seen him during their courtship, as though now that she was truly his wife, he feared she might find his private world wanting. She reached for his hand and told him it was more beautiful than anything she had imagined, and the relief in his smile made her heart ache with love for this man who seemed perpetually surprised that she genuinely wanted him. The next morning he woke her early with a request that she dress for riding, and Eleanor complied with growing curiosity as he led her not to the main stables, but to a smaller building she had not yet seen. Inside, a groom stood waiting beside a mare of such exceptional beauty that Eleanor caught her breath, all dappled grey with intelligent dark eyes, and the build of an animal bred for both speed and endurance. The Duke explained that he had been searching for the right horse for her since before their engagement, wanting something that matched her skill and spirit, and when Eleanor approached the mare and received a gentle nicker of greeting, she felt tears threaten at the thoughtfulness of such a gift. They spent the morning riding across the estate together, and William showed her his favourite paths through woods and along streams, and Eleanor felt the last remnants of her old constrained life fall away as she gave the mare her head, and felt the powerful stride carry her across an open meadow. When they finally returned to the stables, breathless and laughing, the Duke pulled her close and kissed her with a passion that made the groom diplomatically disappear, and Eleanor understood that this honeymoon was about more than simply beginning their physical union, but rather about learning to be fully themselves, together without performance or pretense. Their return to London in September carried a significance that Eleanor felt in the collective intake of breath when she and William entered the first drawing-room as the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft, and she understood that she was now navigating society not as the overlooked wallflower, but as a woman whose position demanded acknowledgement regardless of personal feelings. The transformation felt strange at first, watching women who had ignored her for years now approach with careful smiles and invitations, and Eleanor had to resist the urge to point out that she was precisely the same person they had dismissed mere months ago, except now she wore finer gowns and a duchess's coronet. William seemed to sense her internal struggle with these sudden attentions, and his hand would find hers during social events as though anchoring her to the truth that her worth had never changed, even if others' recognition of it had. Lady Pemberton hosted a tea in Eleanor's honour, and the guest list included several young women whom Eleanor remembered as being similarly dismissed by the arbiters of social success, and she realized her sister had understood that Eleanor might use her new position to extend kindness to those still languishing in the shadows where she herself had so recently resided. During that gathering, Eleanor made a point of drawing out the quieter guests, asking about their interests with genuine curiosity, and she saw in their surprised faces an echo of her own wonder when the Duke had first truly listened to her opinions. Viscountess Ashford attended with a tight smile that did not reach her eyes, and when she offered stilted congratulations on the marriage, Eleanor responded with gracious courtesy that held no hint of triumph, because she had learned that true victory was not in making others feel small, but rather in refusing to let their judgment diminish her joy. The subtle shift in social dynamics became more apparent as weeks passed, and Eleanor discovered that women now sought her favor for vouchers to events and introductions to the Duke's influential connections, and she found herself in the peculiar position of being able to grant or withhold the social currency that had once been denied to her. William watched her navigate these requests with visible pride, particularly when she chose to champion women of genuine character over those of mere beauty or fashionable accomplishment, and he told her one evening that she was making his position mean something beyond empty privilege by using their influence to shift what society valued. Eleanor began hosting small salons where conversation centered on books and ideas rather than gossip, and she invited women whose intelligence had made them social liabilities to speak freely in an environment where their thoughts were welcomed rather than dismissed as unfeminine. The Duke often joined these gatherings, and his presence lent them additional weight, and Eleanor felt deep satisfaction in creating the kind of space she had longed for during her years of social exile. When Caroline Beaumont appeared at a ball and approached with obvious reluctance to request an introduction to a visiting Italian count, Eleanor provided it without hesitation, because she understood that grace given freely was more powerful than revenge. The October morning carried the first real chill of autumn when Eleanor and William rode into Hyde Park together, and something about the quality of light took Eleanor back to that May dawn when she had raced him for the first time, though everything between them had transformed in the months since that morning. They had fallen into a comfortable pattern of early rides when in London, escaping before society fully woke, and Eleanor treasured these private hours when they could simply be themselves without the weight of titles and expectations pressing down upon them. William sat his black stallion with the same easy grace she had first admired from a distance, though now she knew the warmth beneath his reserved exterior, the way he laughed at her observations and listened to her opinions as though they mattered more than anything else in his world. Eleanor had been recounting a conversation from the previous evening's dinner when William suddenly interrupted to suggest they race again, and the challenge in his voice carried a playful quality she recognized as affectionate provocation. She turned in her saddle to study his expression, noting the slight smile that softened his usually serious features, and asked if he thought her skills had diminished with her elevation to Duchess. His answering laugh rang out across the empty park as he told her he simply wanted to see if marriage had made her complacent, and Eleanor felt the old competitive spark ignite in her chest as she informed him that she would be delighted to teach him the same lesson twice. They set the same course as before, from the oak tree to the distant gate, and William asked if she was quite certain she wished to challenge him again, and something in his tone made Eleanor's eyes narrow as she asked what precisely he meant by that question. He met her gaze with an expression of studied innocence and told her only that she should not assume history would repeat itself, and Eleanor felt a flutter of something that was not quite doubt, but rather a new curiosity about what might happen when he did not hold himself back. The starting moment came with a shared look and simultaneous movement, both horses leaping forward with the powerful grace of animals bred for speed, and Eleanor gave her mare full rein and felt the familiar joy of wind and motion. But this time William kept perfect pace beside her, his stallion's longer stride matching her mare's quicker movements, and Eleanor realized with a jolt that ran through her entire body that he was truly racing her this time without restraint or hidden purpose. She leaned lower over her mare's neck and urged her faster, feeling the animal respond with everything she had, and beside her William did the same, and the park flashed past in a blur of gold and green. The final stretch approached, and Eleanor knew it would be desperately close, both horses straining with magnificent effort, both riders completely focused, and when they thundered past the gate, Eleanor was not entirely certain who had won until William pulled up beside her with an expression of genuine astonishment and told her she had beaten him fairly. The breathless moment of realization hung between them as Eleanor understood what this meant, that she had won both races through her own skill, that he had given her nothing except the gift of taking her seriously enough to compete without pretense. And when their eyes met, she saw in his face such pride and love and delighted surprise that she began to laugh with pure, unrestrained joy. The winter months settled over London with unusual gentleness, and Eleanor discovered that marriage to William was not the grand dramatic romance of novels, but rather something deeper and more sustaining, a daily choosing of each other that built a foundation of trust stronger than any passionate declaration could create alone. She found joy in the small rituals they established together, morning rides when weather permitted, and quiet evenings in the library when it did not. William reading correspondence while Eleanor worked on letters to young women who had begun writing to her for advice about navigating society's harsh judgments. He would look up sometimes to find her watching him, and the smile that crossed his face in those moments held such warmth that Eleanor felt it like a physical touch, and she understood that this was what she had never dared hope for, being truly known and loved, not despite her true nature, but because of it. William told her one evening as they sat before the fire that he sometimes still could not quite believe his fortune in having found her, and Eleanor reached for his hand and reminded him that fortune had very little to do with it, since he had been the one perceptive enough to see past society's dismissive judgments. They supported each other through the challenges that arose, as they always did in any life. William's navigation of difficult political alliances, and Eleanor's attempts to use her position to create meaningful change for women whose circumstances left them vulnerable to society's cruelties. When William faced opposition from other members of the House of Lords regarding his support for reform measures, Eleanor listened to his frustrations and offered perspective that came from having lived on the margins of privilege, and he told her that her insights made him a better advocate because she understood what was at stake in ways he never could have alone. Eleanor, in turn, relied on his steady presence when her attempts to help other women met with resistance from those who felt threatened by any shift in established social hierarchies, and William's unwavering support gave her courage to persist even when criticism grew sharp. They built a life together that felt both grand in its external circumstances and intimate in its internal reality. The vast rooms of Ravenscroft House filled with their private jokes and shared understanding. Lord Sinclair visited frequently and took obvious satisfaction in telling anyone who would listen that he had known from the beginning they were perfectly suited, and Eleanor forgave him the slight exaggeration because his genuine affection for them both was undeniable. Even Lady Pemberton remarked during a private conversation that she had never seen Eleanor look so alive, and though Eleanor might once have felt bitter about her sister's earlier dismissiveness, she found now that happiness made her generous enough to simply accept the observation with grace. The deepening bond between Eleanor and William showed itself in countless small ways. The ease with which he anticipated her needs, and she recognized his unspoken moods, the way their conversations could shift seamlessly from playful teasing to serious discussion of complex matters, the comfortable silences that required no filling. Eleanor flourished under the steady warmth of being genuinely valued, her natural intelligence and compassion finding full expression now that they were celebrated rather than criticized, and William seemed to shed years of loneliness as he relaxed into the security of being loved not for his title but for himself. The Countess of Westbrook's annual winter ball was considered the pinnacle event of the London season, and when Eleanor entered the glittering ballroom on William's arm in late February, she felt the weight of 100 gazes turn toward them with an intensity that might once have made her wish to disappear into the walls. But Eleanor was no longer the overlooked woman who had sat in corners hoping to be invisible, and though her appearance remained fundamentally unchanged from those earlier days, something essential had transformed in the way she carried herself, a quiet confidence that came from being genuinely valued by someone whose opinion mattered more than all of society's judgments combined. William's hand rested warm and steady at the small of her back as they descended the grand staircase, and Eleanor felt his silent support like an anchor that allowed her to face the assembled company with grace rather than anxiety. And when she caught sight of Viscountess Ashford standing near the refreshment tables, with her usual coterie of gossips, Eleanor met her gaze directly rather than looking away. The Viscountess's expression flickered with something that might have been discomfort before she arranged her features into a smile of forced politeness and made her way across the ballroom toward them, and Eleanor watched her approach with a sense of calm detachment that came from finally understanding that the woman's cruelty had never been about Eleanor's actual worth, but rather about her own need to feel superior by diminishing others. The Viscountess curtsied with elaborate formality and addressed William with effusive compliments about what a delightful couple they made, before turning to Eleanor with words that dripped with honeyed insincerity about how well Eleanor was managing her new position, and Eleanor recognized the performance for what it was, a calculated attempt to align herself with power now that Eleanor possessed it. William's response was coolly courteous, but contained an edge of frost that indicated he had not forgotten the woman's earlier cruelties, and Eleanor felt a surge of love for him in that moment, because he did not require her to pretend that past hurts had never happened, even as he supported her in handling the present with dignity. Eleanor thanked the Viscountess with gracious brevity and turned the conversation to neutral topics, demonstrating through her composure that she would not stoop to petty revenge, but neither would she pretend they were friends, and the Viscountess retreated after a few minutes with a frustrated expression that suggested she had hoped for either cold rejection she could criticize or warm acceptance she could exploit. As the evening progressed, Eleanor moved through the ballroom with William beside her, greeting old acquaintances and new admirers with equal courtesy, and she noticed how differently people responded to her now, not because she had changed in any fundamental way, but because William's unwavering devotion had forced them to reconsider their previous dismissive judgments. Lady Pemberton found her during a break in the dancing, and embraced her with genuine warmth while whispering that she had never been more proud to call Eleanor sister. And Eleanor accepted the words with gratitude, even as she privately acknowledged that her worth had always been present, only now finally recognized. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it an unseasonable warmth that filled Ravenscroft House with light and air, and it was on one such brilliant morning in late March that Eleanor woke feeling unusually fatigued despite having retired early the previous evening. She attributed the exhaustion to the busy social schedule they had maintained throughout the winter months, and thought little of it until the pattern persisted for several days, accompanied by a subtle queasiness that made her morning tea suddenly unappealing. Eleanor was not naive about such matters, and the possibility that occurred to her filled her with a mixture of excitement and trepidation that made her hesitant to speak of it until she could be certain. So she waited another week before consulting with the physician, who confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. The news that she was expecting a child struck Eleanor with an intensity of emotion she had not anticipated. Joy and wonder mingling with a sudden fierce protectiveness toward this new life growing within her, and her first thought was of William and how he would receive such news. She found him in the library that afternoon reviewing correspondence, and when she entered, he looked up with the immediate warm attention he always gave her, but something in her expression must have communicated the significance of the moment, because he set aside his papers and crossed to her with concern, evident in his face. Eleanor took his hands in hers and told him simply that they would be welcoming a child before the year ended, and for a long moment William simply stared at her as though he could not quite process the words, before his face transformed with a joy so profound it brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. He pulled her into his arms with a tenderness that acknowledged her fragility while conveying his overwhelming happiness, and when he finally found words, they came in a rush of barely coherent gratitude and wonder that she was giving him this gift. They spent the remainder of that day in a bubble of shared anticipation, discussing names and possibilities and all the ways their life would change, and William's hand kept returning to rest gently against her still flat abdomen, as though he could somehow connect with the child through that touch. In the weeks that followed, William became almost comically protective, insisting that Eleanor rest more and ride less, and avoid any activity that might pose even the smallest risk, and though Eleanor found his concern occasionally excessive, she was deeply moved by the devotion behind it. They began planning for the nursery and interviewing potential nurses and discussing what kind of parents they hoped to be, conversations that often stretched late into the evening as they explored their hopes and fears about this new responsibility. Eleanor found herself reflecting often on how far they had come from that morning in Hyde Park, when she had been invisible and resigned to a narrow life, and the fact that she would now bring a child into the world within the security of William's love felt like a blessing beyond anything she had dared imagine. William told her one evening that he kept thinking about that race and how close he had come to never knowing her, and Eleanor reminded him that fate or fortune or simple human connection had brought them together despite all the forces that might have kept them apart, and she felt profound gratitude for every choice and chance that had led to this moment of joyful anticipation. Eleanor returned to Hyde Park on a mild morning in early September when her condition had become unmistakably visible to any observer, the swell of her belly evident beneath the flowing lines of her riding dress, and though she no longer mounted a horse herself, she found profound pleasure in walking the familiar paths with William beside her, while they watched other riders enjoy the freedom she had temporarily surrendered. The park was less crowded at this early hour, with only a handful of dedicated equestrians taking advantage of the soft morning light, and Eleanor found her gaze drawn to a young woman sitting alone on a bench near the edge of the riding path, her posture suggesting the same mixture of longing and resignation that Eleanor remembered so well from her own days of watching from the periphery. The woman was perhaps 24 or 25, with an unremarkable face and unfashionable clothing, and Eleanor observed how other riders passed without acknowledgement, as though she were simply part of the landscape rather than a person worthy of notice, and the sight stirred something deep within Eleanor's heart because she recognized in that solitary figure the ghost of who she had once been. She touched William's arm and gestured toward the young woman, and he followed her gaze with immediate understanding because he had become intimately familiar with Eleanor's particular sensitivity toward those whom society overlooked, and together they altered their path to bring them closer to the bench where the woman sat. As they approached, Eleanor could see the woman's eyes following the riders with an expression of wistful appreciation, and when the woman noticed Eleanor and William drawing near, she quickly looked down as though embarrassed to be caught staring, a gesture of social self-consciousness that Eleanor understood perfectly. Eleanor greeted her warmly and introduced herself and William, and the young woman rose with flustered surprise and curtsied deeply while introducing herself as Miss Sarah Thornhill, daughter of a retired solicitor, and Eleanor could see the confusion in her eyes about why a duchess would speak to someone of her unremarkable station. Eleanor asked if Miss Thornhill enjoyed riding, and watched the woman's face transform with cautious enthusiasm as she admitted that she loved horses more than almost anything, but had few opportunities to ride in London. And Eleanor heard in those words an echo of her own younger self. They spoke for several minutes about horses and riding, and Eleanor felt William's supportive presence beside her as she gently drew Miss Thornhill into conversation, asking questions that demonstrated genuine interest rather than polite condescension, and she watched the young woman gradually relax and speak more freely. Before they parted, Eleanor mentioned that she and the Duke often rode early in the mornings when they were in town, and suggested that Miss Thornhill might join them sometime if she wished, an invitation that brought such naked hope and gratitude to the woman's face that Eleanor felt tears prick her own eyes. As they walked away, Eleanor leaned into William's arm and felt his hand come to rest protectively over hers, and she knew without words that he understood why this small gesture of inclusion had mattered so much to her, because he had been the one who had first extended such grace to her when she had needed it most, and now she had the privilege and responsibility of passing that kindness forward to others who sat alone and overlooked, watching life from the margins and wondering if they would ever be truly seen. Eleanor's labour began on a crisp November evening, just as the first stars appeared over Ravenscroft estate, and though she had prepared herself intellectually for what was to come, the reality of bringing new life into the world proved both more difficult and more profound than anything she had imagined. William remained as close as the midwife would permit, his usual composure shaken by Eleanor's pain, despite her repeated assurances that all was proceeding normally, and she found his visible distress oddly comforting because it reflected the depth of his love, even as she wished she could spare him the anxiety. The labor stretched through the night and into the grey dawn, and when their daughter finally entered the world with a vigorous cry that seemed to fill every corner of the great house, Eleanor felt a surge of emotion so powerful it transcended exhaustion and pain. Pure wonder at this tiny, perfect being who had been created from their love. William wept openly when the midwife placed their daughter in his arms, and Eleanor watched through tears of her own as he gazed down at the baby with an expression of reverent amazement, and when he brought the child to Eleanor and placed her gently against her breast, she felt a completeness she had not known was possible. They named her Charlotte Grace after Eleanor's late brother Charles, a choice that honored the memory of the person who had taught Eleanor to ride and to find joy in freedom. And William held Eleanor's hand as they spoke the name aloud for the first time, and promised their sleeping daughter that she would grow up knowing she was cherished beyond measure. The months that followed brought the expected challenges of new parenthood, along with joys that surprised them both with their intensity, and Eleanor discovered reserves of strength she had not known she possessed, while William revealed a tenderness in fatherhood that deepened her love for him even further. Charlotte proved to be a spirited child from the beginning, curious and determined, and blessed with lungs that could summon assistance from remarkable distances, and Eleanor often thought she saw glimpses of her brother's adventurous nature in their daughter's bright eyes. As Charlotte grew from infant to toddler to a small girl of remarkable energy, Eleanor and William maintained their morning rides whenever possible, and it became their tradition to bring Charlotte to the stables even as a baby, so she would grow familiar with horses from the earliest age. When Charlotte turned 3, they placed her on her first pony, a gentle creature chosen specifically for a child's introduction to riding, and Eleanor felt her heart might burst as she watched William walk beside their daughter and guide her through the basics with infinite patience. Charlotte took to riding with the same natural enthusiasm Eleanor had possessed at that age, and by the time she reached 5, she was racing around the paddock with a fearlessness that both delighted and terrified her parents in equal measure. The years has flowed past with the particular sweetness that comes from a life built on genuine love and mutual respect, and Eleanor often found herself pausing in ordinary moments to marvel at the extraordinary gift she had been given, this family and this happiness that had seemed impossible during those lonely mornings when she had watched Hyde Park from the margins and believed herself destined for permanent invisibility. Eleanor stood at the fence of the paddock at Ravenscroft Estate on a golden afternoon in late spring, 8 years after that fateful race in Hyde Park, watching as Charlotte, now approaching her 8th birthday, guided her pony through a series of jumps with the fearless grace that Eleanor recognized as an inheritance from her late brother, Charles, and beside Eleanor stood William with their second child. A son named Thomas, who was 4 years old and already demonstrating the same passionate interest in horses that seemed to run through the family like a river of pure joy. William's hand rested at the small of Eleanor's back in that familiar gesture of affection that had become so natural between them over the years, and she leaned into his touch while they watched Charlotte complete her circuit and turn toward them with a triumphant smile that lit her entire face, and Eleanor felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever she contemplated the extraordinary gift she had been given, this life that had once seemed so impossibly beyond her reach. After Charlotte had finished and Thomas had been given his turn sitting on a patient mare while William led him around the paddock, they walked together as a family back toward the great house in the slanting afternoon light, and Eleanor found herself thinking about that May morning so long ago when she had sat alone at the edge of Hyde Park, believing herself destined for invisibility and permanent dismissal from the happiness that seemed to belong only to others. She thought of the race and the way William had let her win, not through condescension, but through love, wanting to see her joy more than he wanted his own victory, and how that single act of generosity had opened a door into a life richer than anything she had imagined possible. She thought, too, of all the young women like Miss Sarah Thornhill whom she had encountered over the years, those overlooked souls sitting at the margins of society and believing themselves unworthy of recognition, and she felt profound gratitude that her position as Duchess gave her the power to extend the same grace to them that William had extended to her. Later that evening, after the children had been settled to sleep, Eleanor and William sat together in the library at Ravenscroft, and she spoke aloud some of what she had been thinking, and he listened with that quality of complete attention that had always made her feel truly seen. And when she finished, he took her hand and reminded her that she had won their second race through pure skill, that she had always possessed the strength and worth that society had been too blind to recognize. And perhaps you who are listening to this story now find yourself in a place similar to where Eleanor once stood, feeling overlooked or dismissed, believing that your particular gifts and qualities do not match what the world seems to value, wondering if you will ever be truly seen and cherished for who you are. If so, please know that Eleanor's story is not unique except in its particulars, that there are countless others who have walked through seasons of invisibility and emerged into recognition and love, and that your worth does not depend on others' ability to perceive it. Somewhere there exists someone who will see you as William saw Eleanor, who will value your authenticity above all the artificial qualities that society celebrates, who will choose your joy over their own victory. It may require courage to remain open to that possibility, to continue showing up fully as yourself even when the world suggests you should be different, but that courage is never wasted. Eleanor's race in Hyde Park changed her life not because she won, but because she dared to challenge, to step forward from the margins and claim a moment of joy and freedom regardless of what others might think. So perhaps the invitation today is simply this: find your own version of that race, that moment of bold authenticity where you allow yourself to be fully seen. The recognition you seek may come in unexpected forms and from surprising sources, but it begins with your willingness to believe you are worthy of it.